Now you've got the host of The Rachel Maddow Show and the host of the new podcast, Deja News, Rachel Maddow. Rachel, thanks so much for taking the time.
I'm super excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
I actually interviewed Jen Psaki on a Thursday morning last month, and Thursday afternoon, Trump got indicted in the Manhattan DA case, and she very kindly offered to do a pickup shot on Friday morning, but I'm glad that we scheduled this interview after Trump's latest indictment, because not exactly a topic you can skate by. So first...
Although you never know, by the time we're ready to post this, there might be another one.
Might be another one, exactly. So on that topic, is there any planet on which this redounds to Trump's benefit, or is that just wish casting by the right? Because that's the message that they're trying to convey here.
I mean, sure, definitely. You know, I mean, we now have experience with a former president and current presidential candidate being indicted. It happened 2 months ago to the same guy. And so we can actually look at the real world impact of that and see that it does appear to have benefited his poll numbers, benefited him in a way that maybe stepped on the stepped on the launches of his Republican presidential rivals, at least in the sense that it kept him in the center of the news, and it gave them all awkward questions that there's no right answer to from a Republican political perspective in terms of what they think about his criminal liability. So yes, we've seen it help him already. Now, should it help him? No. In the long run, is it a good thing to potentially be in prison and to be on trial in multiple venues for serious criminal charges?
Like,
maybe. But I mean, if it's going to help him in the long run, it means that in Republican politics, it's an asset to be a criminal. And that's a really radical political party. I mean, that then says less about the candidate and his alleged criminality than it does about the party that wants to reward something like that. If that makes somebody's go up in the esteem of your party, then your party is choosing that as one of its core values. And that's I mean, I feel like this is a moment not so much for Trump. Like, we kind of know what Trump did and who Trump is. It'll be interesting to see this play out, but this is a real question for the Republican Party. Is this your standard bearer? Is this who you think should represent your party to the country and the country to the world?
I do think that they already have answered that question so many times over that, you know, it's just kind of us imposing our views onto them by virtue of asking, is this really who you are? Could this be who your standard bearer is? Is this, you know, when he did the Access Hollywood tape, when he did, you know, all of everything that he's done, and we've come back and said, how could this be someone that you're willing to prop up? And every time they've answered the same way. So I think, you know, we're imposing our values onto them by virtue of asking, but I think in terms of their values, they've already answered that question.
Yeah, but I mean, moments like this, you know, real benchmark moments. You got a 3-inch headline, on the front page of all the national newspapers and everything. This is a moment in history, and what we do here will be, studied generations later in terms of how the country reacted to this. But I think you can also think about it in terms of the way that other countries around the world, other political actors around the world look at this. And if we are going to have one of the two governing parties in the United States led by somebody who is potentially going to be governing from jail, or at least from the docket, and they are not just tolerating it, but celebrating the fact that he has been charged as something that signifies his virtue and his power and what he has to bring to the country, that's a real radical moment. For our country and governance, and whether or not we're going to, sort of keep the constitutional framework that we've got, in which everybody's, in which all the branches of the government are co-equal and everybody follows court orders.
A big boon for him in terms of his rise has been the media. And recently we've seen a lot of shakeup in the media, even in just the last few weeks. Fox's primetime numbers are down significantly as their viewers revolt against that network for firing Tucker and generally trying to figure out how not to get sued. CNN's numbers are down as their viewers revolt against the network for just arbitrarily deciding to lunge to the right. Meanwhile, MSNBC's ratings have surged. Your show has been number one in its time slot for cable news for both all adults and in the demo for 2 months straight. Can you talk about the media environment today and why these networks are trying to lead with these very blatant and inauthentic strategies, and it feels like strategies, as opposed to just leading with your values?
I mean, I'm a bad commentator on these things because I'm in the middle of them. It's like the one person who can't tell you the temperature of the water is the person who's been swimming around in it for a while. Like, it feels like body temp to me. So I'm not great at media analysis. I will also say though that my experience, having been through a lot of ebbing and flowing in ratings and in the relationship between the three major networks in terms of who's tuning in and why, and who's in turmoil and who's stable and all these things, it's kind of like it's like the weather in San Francisco. If you don't like it, wait a minute, because it's about to be something else. I do think that these things are temporary. I feel like the networks tend to find their equilibrium after moments of chaos. I don't feel like we've seen radical change in the cable news landscape specifically over the course of my career. I think things change a little, but not a lot. And so we'll see how it shakes out in the long run. We definitely are at a moment when, you look at the ratings on any given day and it's weird. It's not what you would have expected a year ago for sure. And it's certainly, I think, not what you'd expect a year from now. But everybody has to make their own decision. I think the old arguments about whatever happened to objective news, why do we have to have people where we know whether they're conservative or liberal? I sort of feel like at least we're kind of done having that facile, reductive argument anymore. And I do think that the conversation is joined and people are struggling with the question about how to deal in the free press with a major political figure who wants to abolish the free press. Like, it's just, it's the same thing about contending in the criminal justice system with someone who believes the criminal justice system should be dismantled and that there shouldn't be an FBI and there shouldn't be a rule of law and that we shouldn't have to follow judges' orders. Like, when you are in an oppositional relationship, or at least a sort of coverage relationship with somebody who wants to undo what you are doing, who wants to make you disappear, who's just decided that the process is illegitimate, you have to reckon with that. You can't just treat them like anybody else.
To that point, what was your reaction to the Trump town hall, for example? Like, how, I know this is the question that's constantly asked, but how should media outlets cover a guy who is clearly a major news figure, but as soon as you give him any attention, because he is that figure, he'll exploit that attention to basically perpetuate dangerous propaganda, to undermine the very system that he's running to lead? Yeah,
I mean, that's the crux of the matter. There isn't an easy right answer to it, but I do think that's the right question, and that's the start of getting to a healthier answer with it. I mean, I will say though that there is a difference between giving someone attention because they are a contender for political office and polling very highly, and somebody who's, has a good shot at leading their party or getting potentially back into the White House. You have to pay, you can't pretend somebody like that doesn't exist. You have to pay them attention as a political figure, as a political contender. But there's a difference between giving someone attention and giving someone the floor. Right. You also don't have to effectively make them a host or an anchor or a character on your air. You cover them. You don't. You cover them. You don't hand them to Mike.
I've had to reconcile with the fact that I've had issues in terms of like the fawning, overbearing coverage of Donald Trump before, and I think the difference that I try to do when I'm doing my coverage of him on my YouTube channel is to basically ask people, as opposed to just giving him a platform, a megaphone to spew his bullshit, are you leaving after watching my broadcast coming away with more inaccurate information or more accurate information? So you can cover him. It's not the act of covering him. We're not going to bury our heads in the sand and pretend that he doesn't exist. But by virtue of doing it, are you leaving coming away more ill-informed or better informed by virtue of listening to what he said?
Yes, and I think that's exactly right. And I think that sort of discipline is not that hard to teach. It's not that hard to explain. It's a easy to recognize principle that people could adopt without too much graduate school, And the idea is, if he has said something, if he has proposed something about, he's proposed to ban the entry into the United States of people who are Muslims. You know what I mean? Like, you can cover that, and there's ways to cover it that absolutely add to people's understanding about what is important about the fact that he has covered it. You don't necessarily need to play his speech in which he denigrates Muslims and purports to justify what he's doing. What might be helpful is to talk about how this matches other types of leaders in other countries or in other eras who have proposed these sorts of things, what it might mean, why that is an unconstitutional thing, what will happen when that gets into the court system, and what it means to Muslim communities to have this sort of rhetoric out there. You can cover all of those things in a substantive way without giving him the platform to advance the kind of attacks on those communities that he's trying to effectuate by floating that policy. It's just, it's I think your principle there is simple and true.
I can't imagine a world where Trump actually gains support by virtue of being federally indicted, which is what he was here. And that's considering the guy already has enough issues winning an election, but now having to contend with a federal indictment might seem to suggest that his support would actually contract if he were to run in a general election. Would the rest of the Republican Party be better served not to rally around the guy, which is, of course, what they're doing? Or do they just have no choice here, given the hold that Trump has on the base?
I mean, political parties exist for a reason, right? We don't just have people freelance and run on their own without attachment to parties, even though some independent candidates try every now and again. That hasn't generally been our system. And that's in part because the parties are supposed to do something. The parties are supposed to have a role in vetting and elevating appropriate candidates who stand for their values, who represent not just the best of what the country has to offer as a governing class, but specifically what the party believes ought to be sort of their best shot at leadership. And so the Republican Party abdicating its role and saying we are totally neutral among all the candidates, and whoever wants to run, whoever likes that, if enough people like them, then great, we will attach ourselves to that candidate in a value neutral way. We have nothing to say about it. I mean, it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, it's within living memory, the Republican Party detached itself aggressively from David Duke, who was, running in Louisiana.
Yeah.
And it made a difference to have the Republican president at the time say, you know what, that's not who we are. And that's not the kind of candidate who we are attached to, and no Republican should support them. I mean, that's happened before, even in more recent living memory. You might remember the issues with Congressman Steve King of Iowa, who was getting more and more aggressive and overt in his white supremacism. And this era's Republican Party said, Steve King, you can't actually function in Congress anymore. We're effectively de-endorsing you. We're taking you off your committees, and we're going to fund a challenger to you. We don't support you anymore. The parties exist for a reason, and it is not just fundraising. The parties exist to vet candidates at a very basic level. And to make sure that we don't have people who are totally inappropriate to the job, aspiring for the job with the party support. And so, they can decide, they could make a substantive decision about Donald Trump. They've decided not to, but it is within the realm of possibility. And I think that's a question that probably should be asked more, rather than assuming that they're powerless in this.
Yeah, and I would also add that another responsibility of these parties inherently is to win elections and have some type of a platform that would lend itself to garnering more support. And the irony of what's happening now with these parties, by virtue of seeing that they're espousing positions that are losing them support, but still opting instead to pretend that they've won, even despite not doing the work that it takes to win them, and just pretending that they won in Texas and Georgia and Michigan and Arizona and Wisconsin, is kind of so antithetical to what the point of this all is, which is, again, to propose an agenda that will garner them those votes and then govern effectively. But now they're doing the opposite. They're proposing agendas that are so extreme. They're proposing abortion bans and LGBT bans and interstate travel bans and book bans and vowing to cut earned benefits, and not doing the work of making themselves accountable to the people that they're supposed to represent, because they feel like they don't need to anymore, because when push comes to shove and it comes to election time, they're just going to say that they won anyway. And that kind of is like, for the first time, we're seeing like what happens when a party kind of goes off the rails from what it's supposed to be doing inherently.
Well, I think there is just in political science terms, there's a relationship between the unpopularity of your agenda and the degree to which you want democratic accountability for your policies, right? Like if you want to do stuff that's really unpopular, you don't want to be democratically accountable for the reaction to those policies. And so I don't think it's a surprise that we're seeing counter-majoritarian moves like, in Ohio where Republicans are saying, oh, people can no longer vote about what's in the Constitution, or we're going to make it harder for people to vote about what's in the Constitution, because if we let Ohio voters do that, they're going to undo our abortion ban. So therefore, we'll make it harder for people to cast that kind of a vote at a popular referendum. I mean, you play with the mechanisms of feedback when you don't like the feedback that you're getting. And you can do that, you can sort of game the system in the short run, but in the long run, if you're doing stuff that people don't want you to do, then you're going to have a problem in a democracy. And either you then try to undo democracy or you adjust so that you're more in line with the will of the people.
As far as the 2024 race goes, we've now watched the Republican field blow up to the point that we're effectively reliving 2016, with the irony being that all of those Republicans are running presumably because they think that Trump shouldn't be the next president, and yet by virtue of there being so many candidates, they are effectively doing their part to hand him the nomination. Now, your new podcast, again, is called Deja News, comes out Monday, June 12th. It looks at the ways that history repeats itself. And you're obviously going a little farther back than 2016, but this still does prove the thesis of that theory that history repeats itself to a pretty staggering degree. Were you struck at all by the extent to which even recent history is repeating itself with regard to the Trump of it all? And speak about Deja News here.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea of Deja News is that when things have happened that seem crazy, that seem unprecedented, that seem like we have to invent a whole new way of responding to this because we've never contended with anything like it, there is sometimes something else in history, especially, something from another, not just another era, but maybe another place that can give us a frame of reference in terms of what it's looked like when something like this has happened before. And so episode 1 is there's a parallel in history in another country of something very much like the January 6th attack on Congress that happened in another country. And in that other country, it actually worked. It did stop the transfer of power. It did install a pro-fascist right-wing government to replace a elected center-left government. So that's helpful to me to understand these things. And I think there's a way in which there are processes in our political system that by nature recur. Like we're going to have a field of candidates running for a major party nomination every 4 years on both sides. Like that's just going to happen. And so that is less a sort of historical echo than it is like, is there a learning curve? The last time this very unusual sort of pro-authoritarian Republican populist candidate was on the ballot, look at what happened when there were 16 other Republicans running against him. Okay, well, now he's on the ballot again. There's going to be at least 10 other Republicans who are running against him. Have they learned from the last time this happened in 2016? They had a dress rehearsal in terms of what it means to run against him. I do think actually that if you listen to the way that some of the candidates are talking about this primary, it's clear kind of who gets the lesson of what went wrong in 2016 and who didn't. All the candidates who, when asked about Trump, say, I don't want to talk about Trump. I'd like to talk about what I bring to the table. You can tell they were asleep in 2016. The candidates who actually are trying to run by running against him, by saying, here's why he shouldn't be the nominee, I think that's the obvious lesson of 2016. And so few people were willing to do that in a sustained way in 2016. We'll see if they can sustain it in 2024.
Well, we'll see if the Asa Hutchinsons out there catch fire in the Republican primary.
But what do you think about Asa Hutchinson versus Chris Christie, though, right? So like Asa Hutchinson and Chris Christie are both going to be less than 1% candidates, but both of them want to contend enough to mount anti-Trump candidacies and to keep anti-Trump attacks alive in that primary process. Right. Not a bad strategy.
No.
Particularly if everybody else is going to be going, oh, well, I don't think that we should be persecuting him, but I would rather cut the deficit.
Right.
I mean.
Right. Yeah. Well, let's finish off with this. I listened to the pilot episode, which again will be out on June 12th. It's fantastic. Like you said, it explores the similarities between January 6th and another date where a coup to overtake the government actually did work. I know that episode 2 is going to focus on what DeSantis is doing in Florida, and that was tried before, which I'm very excited to listen to. Was there an episode in particular that you're especially partial to?
Oh, it's a good question. I mean, it's a limited series. So this is just 6 episodes. And the first one comes out Monday, June 12th. They'll come out every Monday thereafter. And I don't want to give you the topics of the other ones because I feel like part of it is like there's definitely a spoiler effect in terms of doing this thing. But I mean, I kind of love all of them. The first one, there's a reason that we put it first. No, we didn't know that the former president was going to be indicted before, I guess he's going to be arraigned the day after the first episode comes out, which is just crazy timing. But in terms of contending with radical movements that are trying to undo democratic institutions, this is helpful. So I think we sort of hit the bullseye in terms of modern resonance. So I'm really happy that one's first. But I hope that all of them. I mean, again, the idea is, if history doesn't appeal to everybody in terms of contextualizing what's going on in the news, but to the extent that it is something that works for you and that helps you understand what's going on, all of these historical analogies that we're going to bring to the fore through this podcast, I think they can just make us calmer and more confident and better informed with contending with things that can otherwise sort of feel overwhelming. It's if you are overwhelmed and particularly if you're outraged by what's happening with DeSantis targeting the LGBTQ community in Florida and the Republican Party helping him do that there, I do think it's helpful to hear episode 2 of Deja News, where we talk about how Florida conservatives did that before and what happened to them when they really went too far.
Well, we'll leave it there. That seems like a great place to stop. So, of course, you can check out Rachel Maddow on MSNBC. And trust me, you will want to download Deja News wherever you listen to podcasts. Rachel, thank you so much for taking the time.
It's been great. Thank you so much. This is fun.